Good morning together, this is Christian from Germany. In my new video I will show you a very good setup against the Sicilian Taimanov and Paulsen variation when the pawn from black is on e6. Okay, let's start with pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, then we have knight to c6 or immediately e6. That is no big difference because it leads to the same positions. After pawn to d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and then we have e6. And that are the French Sicilian variations with pawn on e6. And against this, I have to mention that to build the Marasi bind with pawn to c4 is a very bad choice from white. I will simply show you that, for example, if you play this with black, and the move against this refuting move is queen to b6. And then if we choose the logical bishop to e3, he can simply take the pawn on b2, so that is not good. Better is to retreat the knight, but this is also very bad because after bishop to c5 attacking the f2, we can block this with the knight, but then he can simply capture, and after bishop takes, queen takes on b2, and black is also better. So that is the reason why we have to play knight to c3 at this position. And the variations we're going to look for are pawn to a6, which is called the Paulsen variation, and queen to c7, which is called the Sicilian Taimanov variation. Okay, before we look at that, I want to show you why you don't have to be afraid for moves like bishop, b4 or c5. It's very important to understand this and to feel safe. At first we look at the move bishop to b4. And you can remember, if your opponent plays bishop to b4, in the open Sicilian it is always good to play knight to b5 if this square is not protected by the a6 pawn. Because if bishop captures, knight captures, and you have a very comfortable game. And on the other hand, if you place a normal move like knight to f6, you just play a3 and kick this bishop away. Bishop has to take, knight takes, and you also have a very comfortable game. If you want to see a game, I can show you very shortly. For example, pawn to d5, e takes d5, and I take the better move for you, and this is knight takes on d5. Then we have bishop on d2, knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes. This is an open game where white has a slight advantage, and I can show you that also after a castle. We have to stop this pawn to e5 push. This is a chance for black here. And now he plays the rook on e8, tries to push e5 again, but then we just play g4, and now after e5 we play f5. And at next I'm going to show you a few computer moves, and you will see how good, how strong white's position is. So only doing something with the kingside pawns, then the rook will be active, and after a few moves you can see that black's rook on a8 is not in the game, and also the bishop is very passive, and black has pawns where are unprotected. So this is all in all a very bad position for black. The other move, which looks a little bit dangerous, is bishop to c5. But this is also a blunder, because you can just play knight to b5 also. And now you can see this hole on d6, and you can get use of that. So let's say black plays knight to f6, and then we just play bishop to f4. So we're threatening knight to c7. Okay, after castle. Now we don't have the check with knight to c7. Instead we just play bishop to c7 and kick the queen away. Queen goes to e7. And then we play bishop to d6, attacking queen and the rook. So he forcefully has to capture with the bishop. And after queen takes and queen goes back, we go for a castle on the queen side. And we have much more active game where black has no space to develop his own pieces. Let's have a look at the main part in this video. And the main part arises after queen to c7 or pawn to a6. And the good side on my system is you only have to learn one line for white against both of these moves. So you can play the same system against Sicilian Taimanov or pawn to a6 Sicilian Paulsen variation. Okay, so we look at first at queen to c7, the Sicilian Taimanov, and the move I can recommend to you is to play bishop to e2. Okay, and now before we look at my own system, I want to give you an introduction into Sicilian Taimanov variations, what you can play, and will explain you why I like my own system mostly. Okay, let's start. In this position are many ways to continue the game and many systems. I only want to show you very short why I don't like these variations and why I think my system is better. Okay, let's start. The first system goes with bishop to e3, and then you just play later on queen to d2, castle on the queen side very soon, and then just run with your pawns on the king side. It is, I think, a very risky variation. Black gets a very good counterplay on the queen side, and black has many tactical threats, especially with bishop to b4 later, so I don't like these variations too much. So what else can be played? Let's go back. This is the standard position. Another system goes also bishop e3 and then queen to f3, queen to g3, and so on and so on. This is a modern variation for white. This is a very good variation, but I like my own system more. Also because you can play this against Sicilian Taimanov and Sicilian Paulsen. And yes, I like my own system. Okay, what else can you play? You can also play the fianchetto on the king side with g3, bishop g2, castle on the king side. This is also playable, but I think it is not too aggressive. The positions are quite equal and boring, I think, so I cannot recommend this. And there is one last line, which is also very dangerous and very tricky, but you have to know exactly what you're doing. And this is after knight to b5, attacking the queen immediately. Queen has to go back to the b8. And then we just play bishop to e3, after knight to f6. That will be a normal game, a passive game. After pawn to a6, you can play a very tricky and cool move, which is bishop to b6. And after pawn takes, knight takes, there are a few possibilities for black. And if you know these lines exactly, it can be very hard time for black. But if you find the right moves, you play with one piece down. You can try to go to get an advantage with white. Yes, that's right. But you have to make an attacking move by move by move. And if you make one false move, you are one piece down. And I think that cannot be the target from white to play with one piece down. You're playing white. You have to play for a positional advantage, and especially against grandmasters or strong players, I think it is not that good. So that's the reason why I cannot recommend the move knight to b5. This is very risky, but at the club level I think it is quite funny, or in blitz games quite funny to play. Okay, let's come back to our star move, bishop to e2. The next move is, I would say, about 90% for black, pawn to a6. And now we are in Sicilian Paulsen, where our system also works. Okay, we develop at next our dog square bishop to e3. And here, actually in this position, black can go wrong very quickly. Let's say he plays the natural looking move, bishop to c5. But then he overlooked our big trap. The trap is knight to b5, attacking the queen and the bishop. So queen forcefully has to go to the b6. And then bishop takes, queen takes, and knight to c7. And we are the whole rook up. On the other hand, we have the move bishop to b4. That seems to be a very good move, because now we cannot play knight to b5 and setting a threat and defending the knight. if you cannot play knight to b5, you can remember always capture the knight on c6. And let's say queen takes, for example, then you have to defend this knight because it is attacked twice. So we have queen to d4, and after bishop takes, pawn takes, now we have a very strong game where the plans are easy for white. We want to push the pawn, castle on the king's side, playing f3, and looking what's going on. For instance, I can show you an example game, and it follows with knight to f6, then defending the e4 with pawn to f3, castle and castle. And now you can see how strong white's position is. So d5, then we push e5, knight has to go away. Then we just play c4, breaking up the center. And I just show you the computer moves here. And after only a few moves, you can see that to have the strong bishop pair with white, black has an isolated pawn, for example, if you play it like this, and it is much more easy to play this position as white. The computer gives us +2 for white. The good side in my system is the strongest moves for black are the passive bishop e7 and the knight to f6. Both of them lead to passive positions for black, and that I can show you now. And these are the two most important lines for you, bishop e7 and knight f6. So have a look at that. We start with the move bishop to e7, and after that you can remember we can immediately push pawn to f4 and look for these three possibilities from black. At first we look for a bad move for black, which is knight to f6. After that you can gain a very good position with white. You can push pawn to e5. This knight has to go away. Knight to d5, for example. Knight captures, pawn captures, and then you play knight to f5. You are threatening to take the pawn on g7, so g6 has to be played. Knight captures on e7, knight captures on e7, and actually in this position you see that black has a double pawn on the d file and a very bad position. So the next moves you want to play are queen d2, castle on the queen side, and then let's go for these two pawns and attack and crush your opponent on the king side. And next we look at a very logical move, and this is pawn to d6. And now we have a kind of the hedgehog position. And at first we should develop the queen to d2, and after the move b5, which is the only counterplay, you have to know when b5 is played, you should exchange these knights. So knight captures on c6, queen captures on c6. And now the next threat for black is he wants to push pawn to b4, and you have to stop it with pawn to a3. Right, okay. Next thing, he wants to attack the pawn on e4. So knight on f6, attacking twice, has to be defended by bishop to f3. Next attacker, bishop to b7. And now we have a simple trick to defend this. We just push pawn to e5. So knight is attacked, queen is attacked. So he has to do something for his queen. So forcefully enough, knight to d5. Then we have the forced continuation. Knight captures, pawn captures, and again pawn captures, queen captures, and now we castle on the queen side, and at this point we have a very easy game. Just placing the bishop on d4, don't allowing any pawn push. The king goes to the a2. If your opponent pushes, for example, pawn to b5, you just go ahead with pawn to a4 and save the pawn with b3, and the king is safe on the queen side, and you can quietly run on the king side. Also, you can place the rook on e1 if you want, or on another file. I think e1 is more directly, and then nothing can stop us to win this game. And next I'm gonna show you the strongest variation for black, which happens after pawn to b5. After that, the rule in our system is when b5 is played, you have to capture the knight on c6. After queen captures, now we're playing a little bit different like before. Now we are centralizing the bishop, bishop to d4, attacking on g7. So knight to f6 has to be played, then knight has to kick away, then knight to d5, knight captures pawn captures, and now here, actually in this position, white is much better because we have an easy plan. We just play queen d2, preparing to castle on the queen side later on, and then push pawn to f5. And this is very strong. I just show you a few moves and you can see how our advantage is growing on. So queen to d2, then we have castle on the king's side, and we can push pawn to f5 immediately. So pawn to f6 has to be played because pawn to f6 is threatened. So pawn captures, and bishop captures. Rook takes, and then we have g4. Let's say rook goes back and castle on the queen side, and now we have a very easy game. Black cannot really attack us, and we just run on the queen's and the king's side, sorry. At least we look at the very important move knight to f6. This is also one of the best choices black can play here. Okay, after that, very important, we just castle at the king side. Don't playing f4 at first now. And black has two choices to go out with the bishop. The best choice is bishop to b4. That's the variation I'm going to show you. For example, he would play bishop to e7, then we just play pawn to f4, and we reached some similar position than before, and I showed you how to punish them. So now we look at bishop to b4. At first, we can capture the knight on c6, because you can remember, if this knight cannot go to the b5 and is defending the other knight, then it is very good move to capture the knight on c6. Then he takes with the pawn because he wants to push sooner or later pawn to d5. Okay, so the game continues with knight to a4. This is the key move in this tricky variation. You can see this. Black wants to activate the rook on b8, but then we play a very strong move again. This is a computer move, pawn to c4. We just want to push pawn to c5 and bringing our knight to the b6, and then black is facing some big long-time problems. Okay, let's see. Pawn to c4 again. Then black plays bishop back to e7. I also play computer moves with black, so that you have to remember. Okay, bishop goes back to e7, then we push pawn to c5, and so he has to do something against strong pawn on c5, and he wants to attack this pawn, so that's the reason why he plays pawn to d6. Okay, after that we just capture that, and after bishop takes, he's threatening to capture the pawn on h2, but we don't care about this, because we have a tricky move which is bishop to b6, counter-attacking black's queen. So the best continuation now for black is only to capture this pawn on h2, check, and then king to h1, and now notice that our king is attacking this bishop, so we are getting our piece back. Let's have a look how the game continues. So queen has to go out of the way, or he can take with the rook on b6. Rook to captures on b6 is the better move. And then we have knight captures and queen captures, and king takes on h2 at least. And now white is an exchange up. White doesn't have single pawns like the c pawn or the a pawn from black. And that's the reason why white is much better here. Okay. That was all I want to show you for today. Let me know if you have some questions in the system. Maybe this system already exists, like a classical variation, but I don't found much in the internet or like that. So that's the reason why I called this my own system. And yes, I wish you much fun with this, much success, and take care. Bye bye.